Good afternoon, and welcome to the next installment of the Spring 2021 Virtual Book Talk series, sponsored by the Program in the History of the Book in American Culture here at the American Antiquarian Society. We come to you from the ancestral lands of the Nipmuc tribal community, a community that continues to thrive here in central Massachusetts. I'm Kevin Wisniewski, Director of Book History here at AAS, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here today. I'm also joined by AAS Library Assistant Amanda Kondik. I'd like to welcome all of the newcomers here and briefly introduce the American Antiquarian Society to you. The society was founded in 1812 by printer Isaiah Thomas. We are a research library and learned society located in Worcester, Massachusetts. We're devoted to understanding and sharing the history and culture of North America before the 20th century. As a library, we collect, preserve, and share the printed record of what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, and the graphic arts. In addition to this virtual book series, we have a variety of public programs. We offer visiting research fellowships. And prior to the pandemic, we welcome scholars and readers from around the world to use our reading room to work on their own research projects. Before I introduce today's guest, Amanda will offer a quick overview on the platform we're using today.
Thank you, Kevin, and welcome everyone. Before we get started, I do have a few notes on the mechanics of our Zoom webinar format. The chat function is open, so feel free to send your comments to all attendees and panelists. And throughout the presentation, I'll also be posting additional information and links in the chat relating to our speaker, AAS, and FIBAC. And you should be able to save the chat by clicking on the three dots in the chat window. If you have any problems with your visual or audio settings, you can also message me privately in the chat. For the Q&A portion of our program, we'll be using the Q&A function located on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you have any questions for Koritha during or after her presentation, please type them in there. And as attendees, you'll also have the option to upvote your favorite questions by selecting the thumbs up icon. And we'll get to these questions at the end of our program. And finally, I would like to let everyone know that we are recording this program. So for those who could not attend, or for those of you who would like to rewatch it, we will be posting it on the AAS YouTube channel. So thank you, everyone. And Kevin, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. I'd now like to introduce today's guest. Koritha Mitchell is a literary historian, cultural critic, and associate professor of English at Ohio State University. She's the author of Living with Lynching, African-American Lynching Plays, Performance, and Citizenship, which won book awards from the American Theater and Drama Society and from the Society for the Study of American Women Writers. She is also the editor of the Broadview edition of Frances Harper's 1892 novel, Iola Leroy, and her articles include James Baldwin, Performance Theorist, Sings the Blues for Mr. Charlie, published in American Quarterly, and Love in Action, which appeared in Callaloo, and draws parallels between lynching and violence against LGBTQ communities. Her second monograph, From Slave Cabins to the White House, Homemade Citizenship in African American Culture, which is the subject of today's talk, was published in August 2020. Her commentary has appeared in outlets such as CNN, Good Morning America, The Huffington Post, NBC News, PBS NewsHour, and NPR's Morning Edition. And you can also read Koritha's most recent piece, I'm a Black woman who's met all the standards for promotion. I'm not waiting to reward myself, published this past Tuesday in Time magazine. Congratulations on that. It is my pleasure to welcome one of the nicest people I've met, Koritha Mitchell.
I offer you this image of the Octagon Earthworks in what we call Newark, Ohio. I offer the visual, but ask that you focus on what it is I have to say. I want to begin by acknowledging that I come to you from the unceded traditional lands of sovereign nations, the Shawnee, the Miami, the Lenape, the Delaware, the Wyandot. I acknowledge these sovereign peoples as the past, present, and future caretakers of these lands. Indigenous peoples and indigenous cultures have not disappeared. And despite relentless violence, including violent dispossession, the people who cultivated these lands with care and with reverence continue to model life-giving practices while facing forces driven by greed and perfectly comfortable with destruction. The water protectors are just one example. In 1619, long after Native peoples were on these lands, a pirate ship traded 20 and odd Negroes to the financially struggling British colony of Virginia. 2019 marked 400 years since that fateful exchange. And today I acknowledge that the descendants of those 20 and odd Negroes are still working to make the United States live up to its claim of being a democracy. I acknowledge, too, how African Americans' assertions of US citizenship translate into participation in settler colonialism. I make these acknowledgements because US education so often encourages an erasure of these truths, an erasure that is always violent, no matter how religiously we look away from the blood on our own hands. May we all consider the many ways that each of us can make every space we enter less hostile for more people. May we all consider the many ways that each of us can make every space we enter less hostile for more people. Welcome to Homemade Citizenship, all but inviting injury. My name's Koritha Mitchell, and I use she, her pronouns. And especially if you find useful what I have to share today, please know that it's really easy to keep in touch with me. On Twitter, I'm at Prof. Corey, and I try to do a decent job of keeping my website, korithamitchell.com, up to date. Many, many thanks to Kevin and Amanda and to everyone at the American Antiquarian Society for allowing me to present in this amazing book talk series. I am truly, truly honored to join you today. Many thanks to everyone who made this possible at the Society, and many thanks to all of you who have made it a priority to be here live, or for those who will watch later. I'm truly, truly honored, and I enjoy sharing my thoughts with you, but I couldn't do that if you weren't willing to let me. So I'm really, really grateful for your intellectual engagement. I'm also really aware of time, so I'm going to jump right in. Today, I will argue that accurately interpreting Black literature and art requires reading through the lens of achievement. It requires turning away from what we've all been taught to do, which is approach Black history and art looking for protest, looking for resistance. A reading practice attuned to success emerges from acknowledging a key truth. From enslavement onward, Black success has been discouraged, denied, and destroyed. But African Americans have always continued to strive, no matter how often they must adjust their conception of what constitutes achievement. They are relentlessly attacked while marching toward accomplishment, but African Americans never take their eyes off the prize. And they sustain each other in that singular focus by participating in a community conversation that defines and redefines Black success. In fact, I contend that African American culture is best understood as an ongoing, multivalent conversation about success that produces homemade citizenship. Denied basic ingredients like safety by the land of their birth, African Americans create success and citizenship from scratch. This is how I will proceed. First, I will explain what I call know your place aggression by showing how I came to appreciate it and by briefly illustrating its ubiquity. Then, because I believe recognition of know your place aggression encourages a reading practice attuned to achievement, I will demonstrate what this reading practice yields when applied to a canonical text by an African American woman. A fierce orientation toward success shapes Black cultural practices. But this fact has been overlooked because most Americans refuse to acknowledge what actually structures experience in the United States. That structuring mechanism is what I call know your place aggression. I define know your place aggression as the flexible, dynamic array of forces that answer the achievements of marginalized groups such that their success brings aggression as often as praise. Americans celebrate white men's accomplishments, but any progress by those who are not straight, white, and male is answered with a backlash of violence, both literal and symbolic, both physical and discursive, that essentially says, know your place. I learned that certain people's success inspires hostility and that African Americans have long understood this pattern by writing my first book, Living with Lynching. Black authored plays about lynching showed that mobs often targeted Black men, not because they were criminals, but because they were successful heads of household in traditional nuclear families. Black men of achievement were the ones who had forgotten their proper place in American society, so their deaths served as a warning to survivors, know your place. Black authored lynching plays spotlight stable African-American families and show how mobs attack their success while insisting it never existed, insisting, in fact, that Black communities are full of criminals, specifically Black rapists who target white women. Casting African Americans, regardless of their behavior, as rapacious, sexually irresponsible, and uninterested in domestic stability amounts to discursive violence. And whether it is physical or discursive, violence has one purpose: to mark who belongs and who does not. Violence is a way of reminding targets of their proper place, a way of insisting that certain people should not feel secure in claiming space and resources. In other words, violence is a performance of the denial of citizenship, an active rejection of the idea that one belongs. Once pioneering playwrights taught me that African Americans were most often lynched for their success, I began noticing the country's commitment to know your place aggression. Homemaking has long defined who is and is not a citizen. So the traditional domestic success of those who are not straight, white, and male is routinely attacked. Michelle Obama's experiences provide many examples, such as when Fox News called her a baby mama. Besides being a Princeton and Harvard educated lawyer, she was pursuing First Lady status, complete with well-behaved children and an affectionate husband. To call her a baby mama is to associate her with a caricature of an uneducated woman of a lower socioeconomic status and with a domestic image that does not involve being publicly claimed by a man of stature. Recasting a Black wife and mother as a baby mama puts her in her proper place. Black women can be house slaves and housekeepers, but not homemakers. Hostility toward Michelle Obama's domestic success took many forms, though. While she embodied the role of mom-in-chief with dignity and grace, her husband was disrespected, denigrated, and sometimes lynched. A state representative shouted, "You lie," while Obama addressed Congress in 2009, and a governor shoved her finger in the commander-in-chief's face. But more tellingly, as Ronald Kessler reports in his book, In the President's Secret Service, once Obama became president, the Secret Service experienced a 400% increase in the number of threats in comparison to President Bush. Also, depictions of a lynched Barack Obama circulate on the internet and have received likes on Facebook, such as this example. You might remember that Obama's first campaign was all about hope and change. So hope was turned into rope in this image. And this is a readily available image still in very high quality, suitable for printing as posters or in publications. Of course, some of the images include life-size dummies made to look like Obama and then hanged, like this Obama effigy outside of the Dove World Outreach Center in Gainesville, Florida. This is from June of 2012. But to me, even these images with life-size dummies are not the most striking examples. For me, what's most revealing emerged after Clint Eastwood's empty chair routine at the 2012 Republican National Convention. Eastwood had pretended to be speaking to President Obama as he chastised an empty chair. And the next day, an empty chair hung from a noose in the front yard of a middle-class neighborhood near Austin, Texas. Could the message be any clearer? You may be president of the United States of America, but you're still Americans will not only ask to see your papers, your birth certificate, transcripts, but some will relish the idea of seeing you in a noose. Barack and Michelle Obama embody exactly what Americans claim to respect, including an investment in the heteronormative nuclear family. And yet, American words and deeds seek to remind them and people like them of their proper place. Because African Americans have long recognized this tendency, Black literature and art acknowledge racist violence, but not primarily to protest. African Americans simply affirm themselves at the same time that they note that the resulting success will attract hostility. Like the characters in lynching plays, African Americans live their lives and tell their truths. And when they seem to be enjoying too much success or acting like they believe they belong, they receive a reminder like this one of their proper place. Because obviously this is not just a message for the Obamas. Know Your Place Aggression is the context in which my new book examines Black cultural production from the Civil War to the present. I view artistic works as contributions to the community conversation that defines, affirms, and fuels Black success in a nation hostile to it. And because expressive culture is an access point to a broader community conversation, focusing on women's creative output offers particular rewards. Because the accomplishments of marginalized groups inspire attacks, Black women's texts illuminate strategies of perseverance at the intersection of both racist and sexist violence, at the intersection of aggression designed to keep both African Americans and women in their proper place. As Kimberly Crenshaw teaches, when one attends to those hounded by more than one form of oppression, the findings shed light on the experiences of those who live at intersections with less traffic. And so I believe that Black women's works will be more revealing than men's for understanding how African Americans as a group cultivate homemade citizenship. And so while I'm talking about the text examined, I'll pause to share the book's table of contents. And I do this simply to offer you a sense of the larger shape of the study. I don't want this to distract from the more localized points that I'll be making today. So please just consider this an interlude and know that I can put the table of contents back up at the end of the presentation during Q&A. So from slave cabins to the White House, homemade citizenship in African American culture begins with an introduction that I call House Slaves, Housekeepers, Homemakers. And then in chapter 1, A Home of One's Own, I examine Harriet Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl and Elizabeth Keckley's Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House. So in that one chapter, we move from slave cabins to the White House as Keckley acknowledges that she is the dressmaker for Abraham Lincoln's wife. That's why she has 4 years in the White House. In chapter 2, No Really, A Home of One's Own, I examine Frances Harper's Iola Leroy and Pauline Hopkins' contending forces right at the turn of the century. In chapter 3, New Negroes, New Homes, we look at Nella Larson's Quicksand and Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. In chapter 4, we focus on dramas, canonical dramas. So Home as Human, Right, and Black Power, examining Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun and Alice Childress's Wine in the Wilderness. In chapter 5, Still the Master's House, Octavia Butler's Kindred and Toni Morrison's Beloved. So those are texts written in the 70s and 80s that look back to the slavery era. So you can see again in chapter 5 and 6, we move from slave cabins to the White House because chapter 6, The Ultimate Home, Michelle Obama in the White House, focuses on the decisions that Michelle Obama makes about her public persona as First Lady. I take seriously her decisions about hair, clothes, bodily presentation, and how she decorated the White House. All of those become elements of the performance text of her public persona as First Lady. And so I read it as a performance text, similar to the readings of other texts throughout the study. Because my study uses cultural production as an access point to the community conversation that sustains Black people in the midst of American violence, those who are both artists and critics prove to be especially powerful guides. Poet and scholar Evie Shockley helps me identify homemade citizenship as the result of practices of self-affirmation in the midst of grappling with hostility. Her description of academia applies much more broadly. I am neither homeless nor at home in the academy. Rather, I am making myself at home. Making myself at home is both a state of being and a process in which I am continuously engaged. I am doing what I can to make the place where I find myself feel like a home for myself and for my students by acting like, not pretending, but behaving as if the academy is ours. We've been invited in. The situation is often hospitable, but you don't have to be invited into your own home. Because Black presence in the United States has been shaped by kidnapping and 250 years of slavery, this is not quite home. So Black people are always making themselves at home. What they can grasp is not quite citizenship. So they are always making citizenship from scratch. In my study, then, making oneself at home means pursuing success while acknowledging that one does so in an environment that answers one's achievements with violence. Members of African American communities have made themselves at home without ceasing, even though Black agency is often, in the words of Saidiya Hartman, limited and transient. As Hartman explains, African American community relations cannot be appreciated when one overlooks the losses engendered by slavery and its afterlives. These relations can neither be reduced to domination nor explained outside of it. However, acknowledging know your place aggression highlights the fact that it is not just African American agency that is limited and transient, so too is domination. Domination does not simply endure, it keeps reacting to every sign of Black success and to every assertion of Black belonging. Examining Black culture through the lens of achievement is incredibly generative. Such a reading practice illuminates, in the words of Sian Nye, the predicaments posed by a general state of obstructed agency with respect to other human actors and to the social. Understanding how routinely Black success inspires aggression from the nation it helped build allows readers to appreciate the perseverance of Black communities. African Americans grapple with what Nye calls obstructed agency, in that their ability to overcome obstacles and to meet or exceed standards brings violence as often as praise. And what I want us to understand is that African Americans pursue their success very well knowing that. So now what I want to do is offer a textual example of what it looks like to read through the lens of achievement and thereby to identify practices of making oneself at home. Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl is a novelized autobiography in which the author presents herself as Linda Brent, and these are among its concluding words. Reader, my story ends with freedom, not in the usual way with marriage. I and my children are now free. However, the dream of my life is not yet realized. I do not sit with my children in a home of my own. I still long for a hearthstone of my own, however humble. I wish it for my children's sake, far more than for mine. As she both maximizes and challenges the conventions of sentimental romance, Jacobs defines success more in terms of freedom than marriage. However, freedom is not truly satisfying without a home of her own. It is therefore revealing to examine the text for its drive toward achievement and for how often Linda defines accomplishment in relation to home building. Though the concluding passage downplays her individual domestic desire by emphasizing her children, the narrative focus on domesticity exposes how relentlessly Linda defines, redefines, and pursues success while taking note of white violence. Jacobs frames Linda's life story by highlighting know your place aggression, by noting that white Americans are aware that the enslaved succeed in maintaining dignity. So they deliberately try to brutalize that dignity out of them. When Linda's father dies when she is around 6 or 7 years old, rather than allowing her to be with her family, she is ordered to go for flowers that my mistress's house might be decorated for an evening party. I spent the day gathering flowers and weaving them into festoons, while the dead body of my father was lying within a mile of me. The narrative pinpoints why slaveholders make these demands. He was merely a piece of property. Moreover, they thought he had spoiled his children by teaching them to feel that they were human beings. As narrator, Linda records evidence of Black self-affirmation, no less than she identifies reactionary white aggression. And this dual tracking leads Linda to recognize the hierarchy of home building, whereby all Black households are vulnerable, but those based on blood are sometimes tolerated, while those based on choice are always attacked. When it becomes clear that Dr. Flint will prevent her from marrying a free Black man of her choice, Linda bids her beau farewell. She declares, "Hard as it was to bring my feelings to it, I earnestly entreated him not to come back. I advised him to go to the free states. He left me, still hoping the day would come when I could be bought. But with me, the lamp of hope had gone out. The dream of my girlhood was over." When Linda encourages her beau to forget her, she expresses love and affection that white supremacy worked to prevent and attacked when it couldn't prevent it. Linda does not give up on making herself at home, though. She must simply do so under circumstances she does not choose. Hartman reminds us that any evidence of community among the enslaved should make readers appreciate the difficulty and the accomplishment of collectivity in the context of domination and terror. When read for its focus on accomplishment despite the violence it brings, Jacobs' text supports Hartman's claim. After all, while being deprived of resources, Linda succeeds at making home and a sense of belonging nonetheless. She reports, "I still had my good grandmother and my affectionate brother. When my brother put his arms round my neck and looked into my eyes, as if to read there the troubles I dared not tell, I felt that I still had something to love." Even as Linda notes the victory of maintaining and nurturing these bonds, she acknowledges that this modest success would only inspire aggression. If Dr. Flint had known how we loved each other, I think he would have exulted in separating us. As Linda cultivates that which American society would prevent her from enjoying, it is clear that defining and redefining success is an activity that the enslaved take seriously. Because white supremacy so jealously guards intimacies and homes based on romantic love, Linda embraces a domesticity like that of Aunt Martha, one that does not include a partner of her own choosing. Therefore, when the narrative concludes with Linda emphasizing her children's domestic desire more than her own, it gestures toward a defeat that Linda suffered in slavery. Any success she creates after sending her beau away must be fashioned not only from meager resources, but also out of the remnants of crushed dreams. After all, she does not completely choose the father of her children, nor does she actually choose to have children at all. Her predicament therefore highlights the poignancy of Anna Julia Cooper's 1893 pronouncement about the deepest desires of enslaved women. Cooper explains, the painful, patient, and silent toil of mothers to gain a simple title to the bodies of their daughters, the despairing fight as of an entrapped tigress to keep hallowed their own persons, would furnish material for epics. Jacob's narrative and the transformation Linda's homemaking desires undergo highlights the importance of the order in which Cooper lists Black women's struggles. Working to claim a title on her daughter's body becomes the preoccupation because it is likely the realm of most possibility. Her daughter's very existence is so often the result of not being able to dictate what happens to her own body. So shielding her daughter from a similar plight feels even more urgent and even more hopeful. Linda's experience has followed this pattern. So it anticipates Cooper's 1893 description of the painful epics in which enslaved women are forced to become heroines. In this light, the story incidents relates about an unnamed woman proves significant. When her mistress prepares to marry and offers to free the family because she expects to have less control over the plantation, the woman declines. Linda says that she had not been surprised by this response because I had often seen them in their comfortable home and thought that the whole town did not contain a happier family. This family declines freedom because the mistress had always been their best friend and they could not be so happy anywhere as with her. Jacob's text thereby demonstrates that there is no one definition of achievement. Even among the enslaved, success and manumission are not always considered synonyms. Linda, as narrator, tells the family story this way. The kind-hearted white woman who owned them was an orphan and inherited as slaves a woman and her 6 children. Their father was a free man. They had a comfortable home of their own, parents and children living together. The mother and eldest daughter served their mistress during the day and at night returned to their dwelling, which was on the premises. The young lady was very pious and there was some reality in her religion. She taught her slaves to lead pure lives and wished them to enjoy the fruit of their own industry. Her religion was not a garb put on for Sunday and laid aside till Sunday returned again. The eldest daughter of the slave mother was promised in marriage to a free man. And the day before the wedding, this good mistress emancipated her in order that her marriage might have the sanction of law. In essence, when a cabin is a home of one's own, its being a slave cabin is less important. However, when the woman's new husband arrives, he asserts his patriarchal rights. He refuses to allow the women to serve during the day and retire to their cabin at night because that would interfere with his sexual power over them. This is clearly what most mattered, given the fate of the woman's remaining daughters. One little girl, too young to be of service to her master, was left with the wretched mother. The other three were carried to the master's plantation. The eldest soon became a mother, and when the slaveholder's wife looked at the babe, she wept bitterly. She knew that her own husband had violated the purity she had so carefully inculcated. She had a second child by the master, and then he sold her and his offspring to his brother. She bore 2 children to the brother and was sold again. The next sister went crazy. The life she was compelled to lead drove her mad. The third one became the mother of 5 daughters. The unnamed woman had no objection to inhabiting a slave cabin because it had been inviolate. But conditions changed with the new owner's arrival. Of course, what makes her situation unusual is that her domestic success had been respected for so long. The moment know your place aggression emerges, her experience becomes typical. Most bondswomen could not protect their own bodies as this woman had. So Linda seems to include this unusual story to reconcile herself to declaring that her children's well-being is a higher priority than her own. It's too late for her, just as it was too late for Aunt Martha. Linda therefore extracts a sense of purpose from her ability to redefine success in ways that prioritize a domestic configuration that oppressors find less valuable because it's based on blood, not based on choice. That is, she is forced to value a home built on blood relations, indeed reproduction that benefits white people, only because it occupies a lower position in society's hierarchy of home building. Nevertheless, she finds a way to make the power structure's constraints accommodate some sense of victory. Clearly, having been able to enjoy an inviolate home life with a free husband means less when one's daughters end up sexually violated. But what are the chances that Linda would have enjoyed a home based on her own romantic love choice, only to see her children exploited later? Using another woman's story to put that slim possibility into the community conversation, Jacobs justifies Linda's decision to relinquish her original definition of domestic success. Even while enslaved, Linda is always pursuing accomplishment. Those considered white use their power against her, but she is always pursuing accomplishment. That exact dynamic can be observed throughout African American cultural production. Black people often change their definitions of achievement, but they remain steadfast in their preoccupation with it. Scholarship must begin recognizing this pattern because it has consistently shaped the words and deeds that constitute African American culture. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Koritha. The Q&A feature is open for all of those in attendance who would like to submit a question. There is one in there now, which I may actually get to first as others begin to submit. Because there were a few folks who arrived a little bit later, and in part because this first question ties into a few that I had for you, I kind of wanted to just set up what the book was about. You had mentioned this in the opening. One of the striking things for me about the book is the way in which you offer this alternative model for reading canonical works. Often, and you mentioned this in the opening, we see how African-American texts are framed as works of resistance or protest. And your book subverts this reading really by suggesting, in fact, that it's that white violence, that subsequent white violence that acts as forces of resistance. And instead, you ask scholars to look at achievement and success of Black women and their texts. With that kind of setup, I wanted to actually jump to the first question here, which relates to this. The first question asks if you could elaborate a little bit more about the distinction between protest and success. Given whites' hostility to Black success that you document, is it useful to think of Black success as a form of protest?
Thank you for the question. I also want to stop sharing my screen. So is that okay?
Please do so. Please.
Yeah, I wanted to let people see the entire table of contents, but I want to stop sharing. Okay, thank you for that question. I'm actually very committed to not seeing Black success as a form of protest, precisely because I'm just so convinced that when you know that your success will attract hostility, it's very clear to me that white people and their violence is not your driving force. It's just not. And so I think that the important move for me is to actually acknowledge the reactionary nature of white violence and aggression. And that feels like a really crucial move because we are all taught to think about marginalized groups as responding to overwhelming dominant culture. And the truth is, dominant culture knows it's not dominant. If it didn't know it wasn't dominant, it wouldn't constantly pounce at every reminder that it's not. And so I think we grant dominant culture victories that it knows it hasn't claimed whenever we act as if marginalized groups are always responding. No, it's so-called dominant culture that's always responding. So for me, it's been really powerful to acknowledge this kind of march toward achievement. It's about having your own definitions and marching toward that. And as you do that marching, you know that in this hostile country, you will be countered, but that doesn't deter you from marching toward that accomplishment. So for me, the important move is actually recognizing how reactionary so-called dominant culture is, how reactionary white supremacy itself is. In the book, in the introduction, I talk about the importance of the insights that Nell Painter offers us, for example, in understanding how, reactionary whiteness itself is. And so that, to my mind, is the reason why I would never offer this idea that Black success is a form of protest. Thank you for that, though.
Thank you. Also kind of tied to that, I know you wanted to share your table of contents, so I'll mention some of the names that appear in your book. I'm sure I'm going to miss a few of them. But you address writers including Harriet Jacobs, Frances Harper, Pauline Hopkins, Zora Neale Hurston, Octavia Butler, who am I missing? Toni Morrison, Michelle Obama, and several others. At the end of your talk today, you mentioned that all of these women are continually having to redefine what success means. And I was wondering if you could kind of extend that a little bit more, perhaps addressing several of those women, thinking about how those definitions of achievement and success have evolved, as they're continually greeted by white violence.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think, the first move I'll make is to sort of emphasize that the names that you listed, the authors that you listed, what my book strives to do is demonstrate the way that those authors are creating texts that enter into a community conversation. And so when it comes to the changing definitions of success, then what we are looking at is the figures within those texts, how the figures within those texts are changing their definitions of success. So if I take Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God as an example, then part of what you find is how Janie is constantly changing her definitions of success. And the same goes for Nella Larson's Quicksand, where we have Helga. So for me, Helga in Quicksand and Janie in Their Eyes Were Watching God are really powerful examples of how these Black women characters are insisting upon including pleasure as a part of their definition of success. And because they are countered at every turn of having a claim on pleasure, they are countered by the violence of a white society that insists upon labeling them as natural born whores, right? I mean, that's part of how you box Black women in and keep them from enjoying the mobility of the early 20th century. There should be more, mobility, more travel possible. And those are two texts where mobility and travel really come to the fore. And part of what I want us to understand is that white violence in casting Black women as natural born whores is a kind of way of limiting their life choices. It's discursive violence that limits their life choices. But of course, it's related to the actual violence that Black women have experienced throughout this nation's history. In the example that I shared with Incidents in the Life of Slave Girl, right? The country's wealth is literally based on declaring that Black women can't be raped and thereby building more property with their rape, literally. And so when you get into the early 20th century, that kind of sexual violence continues to be a very real danger for Black women, as so many authors that I cite in that chapter discuss. So what I'm interested in doing is following the way that Helga and Janie are forced to make adjustments to their definitions of success. And it's not just white violence, it's also the kind of boxing in that Black men want them to do, because Black men are dealing with the way that they are cast as natural born rapists and the way that that is discursive violence that's attended by physical violence of lynching, right? So Black men are trying to define their success in ways that get rid of pleasure altogether, right? And I talk about this in the book in terms of Aaron Chapman, the historian Aaron Chapman has taught us about race motherhood, this idea that Black women can best serve the race by being race mothers who take a back seat so that Black men and boys can, lead the race. And so I talk about the way that this race motherhood is exactly what we see these characters trying to get some room and some space despite being boxed in by that discourse. And so they have to define and redefine success in order to continue to pursue it. The other thing I want to say about the text that I cover, just because I know that I'll forget this otherwise, I want to say that I'm really invested in this study, in looking at Black women's canonical texts. And to my mind, that's another way of approaching the question of success in the community conversation. But it is very much the case that we find signs of homemade citizenship being cultivated, or practices of making oneself at home being cultivated, even if there isn't this kind of focus on the heteronormative nuclear family, which we find to be the focus in these canonical Black women's texts. And so I just want to go on record of saying that I definitely could trace homemade citizenship and practices of making oneself at home through texts that highlight queer intimacies and alternative domesticities. That is very much possible. But I think the reason why these canonical texts focus so much on the heteronormative nuclear family is because they want to make the point that even when you adhere to what the country says it will respect, you are attacked. And they want us to see that that is the inspiration for the attack, right? It's not simply when you're not conforming, right? When you have a queer intimacy that is attacked, it's like, scholars understand that it's because they didn't conform. What we are less good, I think, at recognizing is when people are attacked for conforming. And I think that these canonical texts by Black women want to highlight being attacked for being successful on the terms the country claims it will respect.
Mm. Wow, thank you. We have another question here that actually talks about teaching. This is actually how you began the talk, right? With problems related to the education system, the formation of the canon, the like, how we're taught to read texts. This question asks, what difference has the approach that you articulate here made on how you teach 19th century African-American women's texts?
I mean, I think that probably my best answer to that is the talk I just gave. Because, the idea that this is not just response, it is pursuing success and redefining those definitions as often as you need to. It really does, I think, encourage a kind of granular focus on what these figures in these texts are doing, right? When we approach the text and encourage our students to do what they've always been taught to do, which is approach the text looking for protest, then there becomes this kind of glossing over of what's actually happening. It would be really easy to read incidents in the life of a slave girl as simply convincing white women in the North to join the abolitionist movement. But I guess the thing that's different for me and what I would be showing my students is even in a text that clearly has an agenda to address white audiences or mainstream audiences, even in texts like that, if you recognize that it's not just about that, but there's always a contribution to the community conversation about success, then you get to see so much more of what's happening, right? So it's not simply her recruiting for the abolitionist movement, it's also her being really committed to showing not just the violence that she's experiencing in slavery, but also how motivated that violence has been by the fact that she knows she's a person and not chattel. Everything about the United States wants her to believe that she is property, not a person. And her knowing that she is a person is a victory. It may be a small victory, but it's a victory that doesn't go unchecked because everything about the United States is trying to beat that knowledge out of her. So for my money, being able to show students that, first of all, there's a victory here in her knowing she's human. Then there's a victory in her actually maintaining so much agency that she can actually form an intimate attachment with a man of her choice. That's another victory. And neither one of those victories go unanswered. Dr. Flint comes out against it, right? But not just that. Jacobs is clear that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is also coming out against her. So white supremacy pounces to be hostile to the fact that she knows she's a person and she's maintained enough agency to want to continue to run her own life and determine what happens to her own body. The entire country is violent to that victory and trying to squash that victory. To my mind, we don't see that if we just assume that this is a protest text trying to recruit white women. The other thing I'll say about that is think about Michelle Obama as First Lady. Obviously, she's addressing a mainstream audience. But when you understand that Black people don't just live to address white people and what they're doing. When you understand that they are always participating in a community conversation and addressing each other at the same time, even in a position like First Lady, then you start to notice how deliberate some of her choices are. And so that's the reason why looking at examples like Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which clearly has a mainstream audience, Michelle Obama, which clearly has a mainstream audience, and even Raisin in the Sun, which was on Broadway and has a mainstream audience, I feel like it enriches our teaching when we recognize not just what that mainstream audience might be getting from the text, but also that when these texts are being crafted, it is never just to talk to a mainstream audience. It is always also part of a community conversation that I argue that community conversation is all about defining and debating Black success in this hostile environment called the United States.
Wow. With that, I think we'll end it there. There are several other questions I know that we're not getting to, and as always, I do send these questions on to our guest. So hopefully, this is just the beginning of a conversation, and I do often try to create a space where our guests can answer these questions on Past is Present, the AAS blog. So hopefully we'll be able to kind of continue this conversation. Koritha, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you all for being here. And for anyone who watches later, I really appreciate your engaging the ideas.
We appreciate you having us, and we appreciate the book. It's wonderful. I would also like to thank everybody in attendance today. I appreciate you as well. This talk will be published on the AAS YouTube channel in the coming weeks, so please look for that. I will send an email out to all those who registered. And I do ask that you check out future AAS programs and sign up for our History of the Book mailing list. Our next book talk features Laura Heffernan and Rachel Burma, who will discuss their recent book, The Teaching Archive, A New History for Literary Study. So I hope to see you there, and thanks, everyone.